Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the American Civil War, and importantly, or more importantly, I guess, from the point of this video, is why it's claimed that the war was caused by and fought over the issue of slavery, suggesting that one side had the moral high ground with this so-called dispute over slavery. But was the Civil War ever about that? Certainly in terms of its causes. Now, the issue of slavery got woven into the fabric of why was the war being fought as time went on. But initially, it had nothing to do with it. And if you look at sort of Abraham Lincoln and the people around him, they were either quite neutral on the matter of slavery. They didn't have a view one way or another, or they didn't think it was the federal government's right to interfere with what the states were doing. If some states decided that they would or wouldn't have slavery, that the federal government wouldn't try and enter that issue or push things one way or another. So Lincoln was very much that. And Lincoln viewed that if he directly opposed slavery, or whatever position he took on slavery, if it was an active position, that it would alienate in the end too many people, so that or too many states. So it really wasn't worth the aggravation politically. So now I suppose about a year after the Civil War, US Civil War started, and the North had suffered a series of military reverses, Lincoln and again the people around him started to shift their position, and when they particularly saw how much the South relied on black labor to dig trenches and complete earthworks and so on, that there was pull the baggage trains. Now, given the South had a much smaller population than about 2 to 1. Population in the North compared to the South, they relied in proportion. They relied much more heavily on black labour to run the war machine, whether it was the manufacturing industries, whether it was again the pulling the baggage trains, digging the earthworks, putting up the trenches, and so on. This was most of these workers were black, unlike in the North, where the majority maybe say. East European immigrants or something like that. So quite a big difference there. Now the North really looked at the idea. They thought that the war may be over fairly soon, but given the military reversals they were suffering, the increasing number of people, casualties they were suffering, and the increasing number of people they were needing to draft into the armed forces, they looked at this in the wider economic political sense. For what can we do to what other militarily we're losing. We're the only reason we've holding on so far is because we've got a bigger industrial base. We can replace lost material much more easily, much more quickly than the South can, because we've got a larger population. We can replace any losses we suffer on the battlefield. So that's the only reason we're still in the game. If it was a one-for-one fight, the North would have lost. So they looked at how can we squeeze the South economically? How can we attack their means of conducting and continuing warfare? So naval blockade was one to prevent the South from trading with other nations and so on. So that would economically constrict them. But the biggest thing that the North considered was that how can we get at this civilian army of blacks that are doing all this logistical work, such as the baggage trains and digging the trenches and so on. So I know what we'll do is we'll just say that all slaves can be emancipated, and that'll cause slaves to defect to the North, or to refuse to work, or to run away, or otherwise cause the South problems. And that was really it, to cause the South problems. So that was initially, if you look at that, there was no moral concern. Now, they may have cloaked it in moral speak, but the reality was this was just a way to fuck up the South and means and ability to continue the war. Now, if you look at sort of if you look at the South was able to continue the war because of repeated battlefield victories and their greater ability to live off the land. And if you look at the marches of people like Longstreet and Jackson and so on, they were able to move around and live off the land to a level and extent that the Northern armies couldn't really manage or weren't able to achieve to the same degree. So these continued battlefield victories that the South were able to do, as much as the military capability of somebody like Robert E. Lee, of course, and others. There were actually quite a few quite competent generals in the South, and a much fewer number of generals of the same competence in the North. I'm not sure why that was, but maybe the North relied more heavily on numbers and materiel, whereas the South just had to be very innovative and inventive. Now, also, we need to look at the type of warfare that was being conducted. The South was attempting to achieve as many victories as were necessary, not decisive victories to knock the North out, but to get the North, convince the North that, look, it's simply not worth pursuing this war. It's just too expensive. It's too costly in life and money and everything else. Why don't we just give these Southerners what they want and then put an end to this? It's just all too hard. That was what the South was trying to achieve. They weren't trying to achieve a final victory. They were just trying to bring the North to the negotiating table, but where the South held many, not all, but many of the aces in that negotiation. That was their objective. So it's quite a limited objective. The North, on the other hand, was attempting to keep the Union together, to maintain the Union. Now, throughout the conflict, and this is probably interesting as well, while there were different views and attitudes towards slavery and what was or wasn't moral or so on, I remember we're talking about a time when slavery was not uncommon. Now, the British had ended it in their empire, but if you look at Africa and all over places like Asia and so on, slavery was still very much how business was done. So this idea that it was a uniquely white or uniquely American or uniquely black and white thing is bullshit and needs to be pushed back against wherever you hear it. But the idea of a moral issue or moral dimension to the war wasn't introduced until the war was a year or two old, and then people were fighting over the morals of it. Now, a lot of this was propaganda, because when you've got a war that's going on for as long as it has, taxation's high, people are being drafted into the army. There's farms where there's no men to do the hard work. All this sort of stuff going on. The population is losing interest in it. They don't want it to go on. It's just too much suffering and aggravation and drama. So you have to gin the population up to say, well, why are we fighting this war? Well, it's because of a high moral purpose. That's why. And so a lot of the propaganda on both sides was adjusted to try and justify why are we involved in this struggle? Why must we carry on? Why must we fight on? And the way you do that is to invoke a high moral purpose. Well, that's the classic propaganda fallback position. Just a simple thing like, well, we don't want those bums down the road telling us what to fucking do. That doesn't fly when people are suffering to the extent they are or often do in wars. So, and with this, the definition of what was democracy and what was freedom, how you would define freedom, how you define democracy, this was constantly changing and being adapted to the propaganda needs of the moment rather than any fixed reality. Surely freedom can be defined. But when you're in a situation where moral high ground is, the winner is the one that gets the moral high ground, supposedly, then the definitions are evolving and changing simply to suit or to best permit that capturing of moral high ground. For example, freedom. Let's say freedom. So, yes, we believe in freedom. Okay, so we as a state have the freedom to secede from the Union. Oh, no, not that freedom. You may have other freedoms, but not that. Okay, well, we believe in freedom, but do we have the freedom to tell a state whether they must be in the union, and they're denied the freedom to do otherwise. No, we have the right to do that. No, we only allow freedom within a certain range, and then freedom outside. So what was freedom? How do we did the South have the freedom to leave the Union? Did the North have the freedom to deny the South to leave the Union? Did any state have the authority or the freedom to abandon the Union arbitrarily? Must there be a majority vote in federal Congress to determine the limit and the, if you like, the extent to which freedom could or couldn't be applied or used or indulged in? Did anyone have the right to tell a state, well, you can or can't have slaves? What is the basis of where are freedoms and how are they defined? And this was debated back and forth, well, not debated, but asserted back and forth throughout and the meaning of freedom changed every few months. And if you look at the newspapers of the time and the commentary at the time, the propaganda machine on both sides was certainly incredibly flexible when it came to defining freedom to suit the political or military even or morality needs of the moment. Now, if you want to project that you've got the moral high ground, you have to say that your definition of freedom or democracy is the better one than the other guy. And we see that even today. I don't know how much more people are advanced now than they were in the 1860s with defining freedom. For example, let's say the globalist controlled Democrats take Donald Trump off the ballot listing for the presidential election. We're protecting democracy. We're protecting freedom. Freedom and democracy. We're fighting for freedom and democracy because we say he's a Nazi. We say he's Hitler. Therefore, we're protecting him from Hitler. Therefore, we're defending freedom. We're the party of freedom. Wait a minute. But if you do that, then the people can't decide, and we're meant to have a free election, and this is meant to be the democratic process where the people decide on their leaders and their who will be elected to hold political office. Well, that's different. We don't define freedom that way. We define freedom in forcing situations that we approve of. So if Trump gets elected, then that's not freedom. If he doesn't get elected, then it is freedom. And really that sort of mentality, we see that throughout the Civil War. An attempt to get the people to believe in a certain definition of freedom was constant. It was the propaganda battle that was constantly being fought throughout the Civil War. And I think today we're not a guns, well, unless you get Antifa and so on the street, but we're not in a guns and battle lines and trenches and cannons in Valley Forge. We're not sort of in that sort of situation, but we're in a civil war that's being fought through every other means other than frontline shooting and bayonet charging and so on. So, and we see that same pursuit of the moral high ground today, and certainly in terms of the globalists, because they have the least legitimate claim, they have to rely disproportionately on lies and untruths and fabrications and inventions in order to seize the moral high ground as they would perceive it to be. And that puts us all in a bad place. You've been with Tassus today, your Pushback Channel, and thank you for listening.